record button. Let's pray. Father, we again come to you today. We pray that you will just give us your peace. Give Margot your peace. Let us be sensitive to your spirit as you move among us. I pray, Father, that you will just watch over all this technology that we depend on. And most of all, Father, we just want all things to be done in a way that honors you and furthers your purposes. And we just give you ourselves and our time and ask you to guide us and direct us through your Spirit. And it's in the name of your name, Jesus, we pray. Amen. Amen. All right. Let me just go over the agenda a bit. We will be spending some time, first of all, with Margot giving us a PowerPoint presentation. Then we will move into a time of discussion. So as you're listening to the PowerPoint presentation, try to think of some discussion questions, discussion topics that you would like to put forth that we might spend a little bit of time just thinking through some parts of the dissertation project a little more in detail. Once we've completed that discussion phase, we will then go into an evaluation phase, which will involve myself as the supervisor, your supervisor on this project. Your second reader will be Dr. Samuels, and then Dr. Willie Katuga, who's with us. Also, he's functioning as the BGU rep today, which I often do, but since I'm the supervisor, we needed to have three of us, and so we would be the voting committee. So after we've had our discussion time, we will pull everyone out of the session for about 15 minutes while we go over an evaluation sheet that we use at Baki, and then we will issue a grade, and we will bring people back into the session, and that's pretty much how the process works. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to mute myself so that we don't get any more of that weird feedback. Let's have you, Margot, go ahead and share your screen with that little green icon at the bottom of the screen. I'm going to unmute you. Okay, if you can, there we go. Great. All right. Well, why don't you go ahead and lead us through the presentation, and we'll listen. And let's give you the microphone.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Payne. Are you hearing me? Okay. Good morning to you in your time zone. It's afternoon for me here in Jamaica. I want to thank members of my PLC who are present this afternoon. Mrs. Lorraine King, Mrs. Keturah Smith was here earlier on, but we had a mix up with the time, so she could not stay for the afternoon session. And I also have Mrs. Carol Hall, who has joined us. She's part of my extended PLC, and I'm very happy to have her. And also in the room with me is Dr. Dacia Samuels, my second reader. My presentation this afternoon is titled The Journey from Donor Dependency to Organizational Sustainability, the Competitiveness Company's Case. In my next slide, I will also introduce the audience for this project, the NGO community, fellow researchers, civil society practitioners, social capital investors, economists, development practitioners. The competitiveness company on which my dissertation is modeled is a small Jamaican company, and an NGO which was established in 2002 and incorporated in 2005. In the next 2 slides, I provide an outline of my presentation, which follows the components requested for the oral review. So I'll give you the background for the project, TCC's capacity development efforts, TCC's transitional funding strategy. I'll talk about the intervention plan, the contributing sources, and the transformational changes and lessons learned. So I'll go down to slide 5 now to speak about why I decided to do this project and why the topic of sustainability for NGOs is topical. I have been working for an aid agency, USAID, for just over 18 years. My job as a contract specialist involves assessing partners, NGOs, and for-profit entities that we provide funding to. One of the issues that has always I have not been able to figure out is how and why NGOs are not able to sustain their efforts beyond the funding that we provide them. In essence, we provide funding for a particular period. Once that funding has ended, then let's say 6 months, perhaps even sooner, they no longer exist. So I understand that there is a need for NGOs to find a way to sustain their efforts beyond donor funding. The literature shows that there has been a historical dependence in the NGO community on donor funding and development assistance from multilateral sources and foreign governments. In fact, donor agencies would channel their funds through foreign governments for a period of time until they found that a major part of the funding, I believe one figure says that up to 30% of the funding was being lost through corruption. And so there was a lot of issues with funding, channeling funds through governments. So donors needed to find an alternative. And this alternative was found in the NGO community. First, because they were seen as close to the grassroots, where they were able to deliver services. And so between the late 70s and the 1980s, quite a bit of funds were channeled through the NGOs. This was also a period when not a lot was known about NGOs and how they operated. As I said before, the nature of donor funding is short-term. Most donors provide funding to NGOs for 1 to 3 years, some perhaps for 5 years, depending on the project. The funding is uncertain. There's quite a bit of competition for the funding, and this impacts on an NGO's ability to plan for the long term. In addition to that, donors sometimes have onerous conditionalities. There are numerous regulations which the donor requires an NGO to comply with. There are requirements for annual, semi-annual audits, and there are a plethora of reporting requirements. Another aspect of donor funding is that donors give funds which are aligned to the projects that they're funding and not necessarily to building the capacity of an NGO. So this leads to a need for donors to diversify their funding sources in order to mitigate the uncertainty of donor funds and to ensure their sustainability. Another factor which pushes NGOs to self-sustainability are the periodic shifts in donor motivation. At one point, it was the Cold War, and donors needed countries, NGOs to stand with them, and they would provide funding. That would be the motive for providing funding. We are in a time, in our present time, just about everything is changing in the world. The US is looking at its development efforts, and they are now looking more at building the US instead of sending funds overseas. We have heard about America First, and this will no doubt have an impact on the funds which are sent overseas to developing countries. So those are some of the push factors for self-sustainability. In measuring, this slide looks at two measurements that I used in the project to measure TCC's capacity, because the argument is that in order for an entity to consider self-sustainability, the entity has to do an assessment of its capacity to see what its strengths are and what areas needs to be strengthened. So I used two measures for capacity in this project. The first one I relied on was conducted in 2010, and it's the USAID pre-award survey. When that survey was done on TCC, it found that TCC had the operational, procurement, and personnel policies to manage USAID funding, and on that basis, we were able to provide them with funds. It also found that because TCC had outsourced its financial management function, that this was a vulnerability for the organization. Thankfully, at that time, TCC was able to work with USAID to mitigate that vulnerability and to use some of the donor funds that they received from USAID to strengthen that area of the organization. The main measure of capacity is the second instrument, the USAID Organizational Capacity Assessment Tool, which I used in 2017. The tool is a structured tool which facilitates a self-assessment of the organization and allows members of the organization to work on an action plan for improving capacity over time. As I said before, I have been involved in using the pre-award survey for just about all of our partners that we provide grant funding to. Out of the assessment, on the next slide, I was able to highlight some of the strengths that TCC has: experienced board members, visionary leadership, adequate and qualified staff, excellent project performance and project program evaluation, excellent delivery standards, and the list goes on. So I have pulled out some of the strengths that I found based on the two documents. the two measurements of TCC's capacity. I have also highlighted some of the areas from their action plan and the priority that the entity assigned to those areas for capacity development. You will note that the first one is fundraising and new business development. That was given a high priority on a scale of 1 to 5, where 1 is high and 5 being low. So at the top of their list, they have fundraising and new business, field support, external communication, because they felt that there was a lot more that they could do in terms of expanding their website so that they could communicate to their external potential clients. And fundraising, that was an area which needed quite a bit of strengthening. Their capacity was low in that area. I won't go through all the items because of time, but I will highlight those and focus on some of the more salient points. So the next slide deals with the transitional funding strategy, which I want to focus a bit on. When TCC started in 2002 up to about 2014, they relied totally on donor funds. In 2014, they were able to make the shift by branching out into other areas, so the entity was not totally reliant on donor funds anymore. 2016 marked a watershed year for them. They were able to scale up the project which USAID funded by getting approvals to export the ornamental fish that the ornamental fish project, which they worked on purely in the local market. They were able to get approvals to ship to 2 markets overseas, to Atlanta, Georgia, and Miami, Florida. From 2014 to present day, TCC also has other streams of income. They provide various consultancies and undertake projects in the local Jamaican market, regionally in the Caribbean, and they also have some international partners. So the intervention was a half-day workshop with the core members of TCC at TCC's offices in Kingston here, where before the workshop, they were given the OCA tool so that they could score and have, give their own feedback on the 7 areas which are listed there: governance and legal structure, financial management and internal control system, administration and procurement system, human resource system, program management, project performance management, and organizational management and sustainability. Then when we sat down in the workshop, we reviewed the scores that they had given prior to the workshop and came to a consensus as to what those scores would be. I also did a site visit to observe their field operation and to interview the staff out in the field. In terms of evaluation, what I did was to look at the pre-award survey results and looked at what we had pulled out as areas that needed to be built, and to assess those against the OCA scores in 2017 to see how the entity had developed and to see where or what else the entity needed to do in order to build its capacity. The next slide lists some of the contributing sources, the literature, some of the literature, not all the literature that I looked at, but I've highlighted some of the main ones that impacted the study. I've also provided the sources for the theology that I looked at, the ethnography, which was studying the TCC entity itself, and some of the courses, the theology of work, personal assessment, and the project design methodology, which helped to form and to shape the project. The next slide, I have listed here some of the transformational changes in terms of my own personal transformation. It's interesting that I've said that I have rediscovered the art of listening, because I found that important when I sat with TCC to understand their own history and where they were coming from and the plans that they have for the company. In terms of professional, I have a better understanding of the historical data and the current ideologies impacting donor motivation and priorities. So I've just listed a few of the changes highlighted. I want to focus on slides 14 and 15 to highlight some of the lessons that I've learned from this project. And the first one being that self-sustainability doesn't just happen by chance. An entity has to plan to make deliberate steps to achieve sustainability. Another lesson that has come out of this that I found is that there are long and short-term benefits of a donor-controlled development process, meaning that donors giving aid has become a business. It's a business that employs many people, and donors may want to maintain that. And recipients, there are some recipients who do not wish to be self-sustainable. They are always wanting to be dependent on donors. And that's a hard thing to accept, but it is a reality of the development process. Another lesson which came out of this research was that not many donors direct funds to capacity building activities. A recipient must negotiate capacity building efforts. If they need to build their financial strength, if they need funding to write policies and procedures for their organization, all of this has to be negotiated with a donor. A donor is not going to offer it. The NGO must assess its own needs and negotiate assistance if that is to be given. Another lesson that I am highlighting is that the culture of dependency is deeply embedded in the development process. And the last two, donor dependency is not limited to small developing country NGOs, even large NGOs in developed countries, NGOs as large as CARE International, Plan International, are fully reliant on donors for budgetary support. They may have a different structure in that they have offices that do ongoing fundraising, and therefore that allows them to have funds coming in all the time, and there is no gap in funding. And the last lesson I have listed there is that much more research is needed in this area of NGO sustainability to encourage the desired cultural change. And my last slide, I do know that I studied only one organization. And in terms of application, I am aware that each organization must undertake its own journey. But like TCC, I think that it would be wise for each organization to first assess its current condition and then plan for corrective action in terms of how they can build capacity over time. I quote here Fowler, 1995, good strategies for capacity building require good diagnosis. Lack of diagnosis is malpractice, whether in medicine or management. I believe that the TCC experience can help other NGOs understand the requirements for a successful transition from donor dependency to self-sustainability. This is the end of my presentation, and I thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Margot. It's very, very helpful. What we want to do now is spend a little time thinking about the project and putting forth questions to Margot, topics that you'd like to maybe hear a little more information on, and just anything you'd like to put forth. So let's go ahead and open the floor to questions, thoughts that you would like to bring forth.
So this is Dr. Samuels, and I want to thank Margot for such an excellent presentation. And to get the discussion going, I also have an aid and development background. I just want her to talk some more on the role of transformational leadership at TCC and how she saw the role of the CEO in ensuring that the changes that were needed to journey along self-sustainability, how she ensured those changes took place. What was the role of the leader at TCC?
Okay, thank you, Dr. Samuels. I think the role of the leader is critical. Dr. Morgan, who leads TCC, is quite a visionary leader. One of the things that we found when we worked with her after the pre-award survey was that their TCC's financial management was being outsourced. And she worked with us. We highlighted that as a vulnerability for her, for the entity, and she worked with us. We were able to pay for an additional position on TCC's organizational plan. So we paid for an accountant, and that came out of the funds that we gave her. And we had periodic checks to see that the accounting was properly incorporated into the organization, and that helped to strengthen the organization. And when the project ended, the entity continued with the position and still pays an accountant. So it's a full-fledged position in the organization. I think as well to look broader at leadership. Leadership of NGOs is a critical factor. If the leader is not forward looking and that doesn't understand the development arena and understand that before a donor funding dries up, that they need to be forward looking and out looking at other ways of sustaining their organization, then it is not helpful for the organization. At TCC, Dr. Beverly Morgan is also a member of the Jamaica Exporters Association. And I think that her efforts at looking outward, what I would call forward integration. So what our project does is that it takes breeding stock from breeders in the local market. So that's the start of the operation. She brings it into her operation, and they grow them to a certain stage. And when that was what our project did. What her efforts were, now she got approval from the Ministry of Fisheries, the Fisheries Division of the Export Ministry, and got approval to supply markets overseas, which has been quite lucrative for the organization. So leadership is quite critical to the sustainability of an NGO. I trust that answers the question.
Yes, it does.
And this is Bill, Margot. Let me just ask one question. In your work with TCC and other organizations that you may know of, are there examples of donors providing funding to actually start entrepreneurial kinds of endeavors, as a means toward sustainability?
Sorry about the delay, Dr. Payne, but I had to get the question, get some help with, because of there's a bit of static on the line, and I can't plug in my earphone. So your question is, are there donors that provide funds for entrepreneurial activities?
Yes.
I suspect that there are, and I think in this phase of development that we are going into, we are going to be having more of what we call private partnerships.
Mm-hmm.
I think as we move away from just giving NGOs or recipients funds, that we will have more public-private partnerships whereby an entity will have to put some funds up and a donor will match those funds. So that's one aspect. There is also what the literature has recommended, called social entrepreneurship, whereby donors provide funding for activities that allow the community to contribute, while at the same time it allows the entity to make to generate program income. So there are donors that provide funding for enterprise.
Okay, good. Yeah, I was kind of, when I worked with the Union Gospel missions, rescue missions, you know, that was kind of a major emphasis was to, you know, develop social enterprises, and we would sometimes get a grant that would actually specifically help fund that type of an enterprise. For example, in Spokane, Washington, there, you know, started a whole used car lot. And so we were able to put some of the people to work in the car lot, but the car lot, of course, then became, a source of income. And of course, the typical, thrift shops, etc., not only help provide funding, but also can put people to work who are possibly being served by that NGO in some way. So that's what I was kind of thinking in terms of the way that businesses and even grant writing foundations can come alongside an NGO, for example, to help them establish programs that will then help them become more self-sustaining through those kinds of enterprises that they might be able to create. So just kind of wondering, what might be going on in Jamaica, within that kind of a framework.
Well, two things to add to that, Dr. Payne, that TCC, the TCC's project for the ornamental fish is somewhat of a social enterprise. Because what happens is that there are small entrepreneurs who produce the ornamental fish. It's an income for them, and they are in areas what we would call inner city areas. So it provides income for these families, and they're able to sell and receive a check, money from TCC, which buys these ornamental fish, which they then put into the pool that they have for export.
Yeah, that's excellent. Yeah.
So we have, it is an area which we are encouraging our NGOs to move into. But there are a number of things that donors still need to do to encourage that, and those are some of the transformational changes that I hope we will see in this new phase of donor recipient relationship that we are moving into.
Good. Okay, others who would like to ask a question?
Well, this is Willie, and I have worked, in fact, for about 20 years off of donor money. I've noticed is that a lot of these projects, they're defined as a number of NGOs to bid on them competitively. Was this the case with TCC?
Yes, we have had. Let me ask the question. Are you asking if the project that TCC, when TCC received funding, if there was a competitive bid for the funds, or are you asking if TCC does competitive bidding for their work?
I'm referring specifically to this project and wondering if this project was allocated as a result of competitive bidding.
The ornamental fish project, which TCC, which I followed for this project, came out of funding which Washington provided under a program which was called the Development Grants Program. It was what we call what Washington issued was a request for grant proposals for Jamaica, and a number of NGOs submitted proposals. So yes, it was a competitive bidding process.
Okay, that's very helpful to know. So basically there was some money available, and then different NGOs could proposal, and the best proposals got the job.
Right. So yes, essentially that is how it happens. The entities submit proposals. There is a committee which is formed to review the proposals. If we do a short listing of the ones that meet the criteria, having met the criteria, we narrow down depending on the pot of funds that we have. If we can make 2 awards, then that determines how much funding an entity will receive.
So one of the questions that I have is an issue of sustainability, because typically what happens, there's a project, then it goes away, and then there's another project, then it goes away, which then increases the dependency and encourages the dependency cycle. One of the things for sustainability, which I would like to get from you, is how sustainable is TCC now for the next few years? Such as, what is their source of revenue, and is that revenue at risk?
Okay, so the USAID funds which were provided to TCC ended in 2014. We routinely do a review if an entity comes back to USAID for funding. Sometimes we will look at what has happened between the last time we funded them and the current request. In this particular case, we did a retrospective review of the entities which were funded under that development grant program. And this is how I came to be studying TCC, because having ended our funding in 2014, by 2016, TCC had scaled up its operation and had broken into the overseas market with the ornamental fish project, that being only one stream of income for the organization. The organization also has additional streams of incomes. There are consultancies. The organization has capacity to do evaluations of other NGOs that have projects from donors. They do a number of consultancies for other agencies, UN organizations, the OECD. So they have multiplied their streams of income and are sustaining their operation. Does that
Because
answer your question?
there's two things that go hand in, yeah. There's two things that I think are key in terms of sustainability. Scalability, because so often the way that the organizations are set up, they're dependent on a continual stream or level. But what happens is that sometimes there's not that much money available, and sometimes there's a lot of money available. And how you're able to scale up is crucial for sustainability. So therefore, it might be nice to keep all the people employed in the organization, but when how do you keep the, how willing are people to keep just the core, knowing that if they all spend all the money, they're not going to exist. They ramp down, they'll live another day to ramp up again. So was this a consideration that was taken in terms of looking at their, that they were very forward-looking?
Yes, yes, Dr. Katiga, it was. When I say scale up, the scaling up was not the scaling up of the staff. It was a scaling up of the project. Because what happened is that when they had funding from USAID, they had quite a robust staff. When the funding ended, they scaled down to a skeleton staff of 4 persons: the accountant, the president, the marketing, and the communications personnel. So they had a skeleton staff, and when they took on projects, they brought people in as consultants. So if their organization was mere bones after the project ended, and they worked with a number of consultants to undertake the consultancies that they did.
So with that in mind, what are some of the, in terms of replicating what TCC did, and not specifically on that one project, what are some of the lessons for projects that take place that are transferable from the lessons of TCC? What would be the core ones?
Could you repeat? I'm going to put my earphones in. The others won't be able to hear, but could you repeat for me, please?
The question is, how would you design a project that would enhance the capability of it to become viable? And what lessons can you learn from TCC that could be applied to that?
So your question is, how would I design a project to enhance the sustainability of an organization? Well, I have thought about that, and one of the ways that we are funding NGOs now, I am part of a group at USAID which is looking at transforming how we provide aid. And one of the feedback that I have given them is that when we provide funding to an entity, it is essential that that entity provides a cost share the cost of the project. Not the sharing the costs helps the entity to identify and to own the project. And when I say a cost share, not a minimal percentage of the cost, but at least 30%, 1/3 of the project cost. That's at the front end of the project. While the project is in progress, I would allow the entity to generate income. That they must design the project in a way that they can generate some income. They must identify during the implementation phase, they must identify some aspect, something that they can generate income from. What we have been seeing is when NGOs apply for funding, we ask them to prepare a sustainability plan. Often that sustainability plan for NGOs say that they will have membership and members will contribute dues or contribute funds. But what happens is that happens perhaps for 6 months, or if they have membership, a membership list of 200, only 20 persons on that list contribute to the organization. So I think the way we fund the projects and we need to look at the structure of a project in terms of those two aspects. I think are critical for design to ensure sustainability. Does that answer your question?
And now the question that you alluded to right at the beginning about corruption and misuse of those funds. How are NGOs responding to your suggestion?
Dr. Willie, that's a tough area. Accountability for NGOs is a tough question. And one of the ways that we try to mitigate against the corruption is the audits. It's the limited scope reviews that we do of projects. I think there are other ideas that we could also look at, but it's a tough issue because we do see that there are NGOs where the owners of the NGOs, it's for me, it's a struggle for me because I negotiate the budgets. And there are times when I really have to put my foot down because the owners believe it's their entity and they need to be rewarded. So when you look at the personnel, the pot of money that goes into personal expenses, it's disproportionate to the work that they're doing on the ground. My task is always to push back and to try and get some balance in terms of the budgets that are being negotiated to ensure that the funding goes to the project instead of going to the personnel. So one of the things that USAID has done, which I think is a good thing, is to limit the number of key personnel that we would need on any particular project. We have limited that. I think it's now to about three persons that we would require as key personnel. And one of those would be the accounting function. So the issue of corruption is a real issue, and if an awareness of it always helps in the mitigation of more corruption.
Thank you. That answer. I have many more questions, but I'm gonna let someone else ask some in the meantime.
Thank you.
So Desha again, question for you, Mark. So what were some of the main resources that you used to undertake this study? So we know you use the OCA tool, which is our self-assessment. So how feasible do you think it is for other NGOs to use? And is it something that's available on the internet that other NGOs could access?
So as I said, I use the USAID Organizational Capacity Assessment Tool, which is a tool which is available. Anyone can download it. I think it's an excellent tool because it's a self-assessment. And even though there are drawbacks to self-assessments, this is a facilitated self-assessment. The entity, the members of the organization get a chance to assess themselves. It provides an opportunity for different levels of staff to come together to have an honest discussion, which they may not have had the opportunity to do. It's not audited, it's not external, it's an internal tool. So it takes away the fear of an assessment or something akin to an audit. So I think it's an excellent tool, and it allows the members to share freely, to look at their organization, to see what their strengths are, to appreciate those strengths, and to identify areas that need to be strengthened. I think any organization would be able to benefit, to have positive benefits from undertaking such an exercise.
And how long do you take that in terms of time? 1 day, 2 days?
Because I gave the test, the tool to the entity before the workshop, I was able to wrap up my discussion with them, separate and apart from going out into the field, in half a day. The discussion could have gone on for a day, but not more than 2 days, to go through the seven areas in the assessment. Thank you.
Since everybody is quiet, I'll ask my next question. How could you apply this to an assessment of the way a church runs or a parachurch organization runs? because first of all, the funding is at a different level. It's not necessarily an NGO, but there's an assessment that needs to be done. You look at your many tables at the back. How easily could that be applied to a church situation? You know, like, for example, a ministry. Let's say there is a building program. It has a budget. It has a lot of. Apply your OCA to that.
I missed some of what you were saying, but I gather you're asking if the OCA tool could be applied to a church organization. And I would say with a little tweaking here or there to make it applicable, that it could be applied to any organization. Because it's a, sorry, go ahead.
No, so this would be also, for example, to a parachurch organization. And the reason I'm asking that is because churches go on, parachurch organizations go on without taking a close look at themselves. And if they don't take a close look at themselves, there could be trouble down the road.
Well, Dr. Willie, this is perhaps why so many of our churches and parachurch organizations are dying, because nobody is taking a critical assessment of the organizational structure itself. I think that our churches and our parachurch organizations could benefit from an assessment of, because the particular nature of this assessment is that it's an internal assessment. So there is no fear of an external entity coming in. This is being done by the members who are altogether having the same mind for the organization. So I think it would be quite appropriate to use a tool like this in a church organization.
So I think you may be getting my gist of this, because what you have done, I think, is extremely useful. And what we need to do is see if we can adapt this tool to organizations. I think that would be a great help in terms of building the kingdom, that we use all the resources that God has given wisely.
I think so too. And one of my contributing sources in terms of courses that impacted me when I thought about a topic for my dissertation, one of the courses that had such great impact on me was the theology of work, and how I could apply that to my day-to-day work in the development arena, and to see similarities and to see how I could apply from one area to the next area, and to unify both areas, and to pull down some of the dividers that I had in my head in terms of secular work, what is called secular work, and what is called non-secular work, spiritual work. So, you know, I was able to bridge the gap just by doing that course. It had quite an impact on me.
Well, the three questions that you asked in relation to the exegesis on the talents. I think those are three fundamental questions that we don't ask often enough.
Yes. What was it? Could you repeat the questions, please?
Oh, the question, there was no question. It was just a remark on your exegesis of the talents.
Oh, okay.
And
Yes.
you asked three questions,
Mm-hmm.
and those are fundamental questions, which I very much appreciated.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
We'll probably go into an evaluation session here in a moment, but kind of a, I guess, a follow-up in terms of what Lily was talking about. I know of foundations in our area, in Washington, and some that we have BGU have gotten grants through, grant foundations that actually do a lot of workshops themselves on helping nonprofits, NGOs become more sustainable. And I'm just wondering, how much, even as future work that you would be involved in, possibly helping to implement some of those kinds of workshops for NGOs, through existing foundations, etc., to help them learn some of the skills that you've observed, say, at PCC, but to be able to, do a workshop that would help NGO leadership to begin to become familiar with some of these kinds of self-sustaining social enterprise possibilities. Do you know, first of all, do you know of any funding agencies, donor agencies that are actually doing workshops for NGO leadership to help them, with the sustainability issues?
I don't know of any funding agencies that are currently doing workshops, but I do know that as a funding agency, USAID, we do share best practices as best as we can with the NGOs which we partner with. But I don't know within the agency, as I said, USAID, the US government is changing how it works with partners. And within the agency itself, there are webinars and a number of webinars that I have listened in on countries raising their own resources domestically in the domestic market. It's a concept that they call DRM, domestic resources mobilization. So as the US government moves away from, and some of this has to do with, in our organization, we say when the Democrats are in power, then there's a reliance on development and diplomacy. When the Republicans are in power, then the politics shifts and there's a reliance on the military. Currently, we are seeing some amount of that shifting. There are a number of metrics which are being done on countries that the US provides funding to, and a similar exercise of determining the capacity of countries that currently receive funds is being undertaken to determine how much longer a country can or should receive funding, which categories of countries can be graduated from funding. And when I speak about a country, the country is at the macro level. It flows down to the NGOs in that country at the micro level. So whatever happens at the country level ultimately flows down to the entities, the NGOs in that particular country. So yes, there are a number of webinars, and I suspect that some of those will become workshops where they will provide tools, provide information to help countries to see how they can raise or mobilize their own resources. And in fact, a number of countries have resources that they are currently not using to assist NGOs. We have a number of our banks. We currently provide a guarantee to some of our banks so that they can feel more comfortable in providing loans to small farmers or micro enterprises. I think that a lot of our banks can do that on their own without some of the guarantees that we are giving them. Mm. But the conversation has to be had in terms of helping countries to understand that they own and they are responsible for their own development at the end of the day. Mm-hmm. A donor can assist, but it's not the donor's responsibility. It's the country's responsibility.
Mm-hmm. Right, right. Good. It just seems like there's a lot of training that's needed for NGO leaders. Those of us saying that are getting training, med training in transformational leadership, it seems to me that would be a great future project. Whatever you could be doing in your particular area to help that kind of training become implemented in workshops, seminars, whatever it happens to be. And if there are other funding agencies that would be willing to come alongside as partners in that kind of an endeavor, that would be excellent.
Yes, it would be. And I certainly would be looking out for those opportunities. One of the ways, as I said, is that USAID is already in the mode of transformation. We have several transformational teams looking at different areas, and I am part of one of those teams. It's early days. It's early days yet. We still have technological challenges with some of our webinars, but I foresee that we will be doing more engagements in the future in terms of developing strategies to help our partners transition in their strategies.
Yeah, there's an organization in Washington called Mission Increase, I think is the name of it. But they actually they are a grant writing foundation, but they do all kinds of training. And one of the motivations for people to get the training is that they can earn credit toward grants by taking the training that Mission Increase offers. And so, it's just one of those, NGO leaders need motivation to go take the training. So they can actually earn grants for their organization by taking so many training seminars, etc. So, thinking of creative ways to get training out there, to me, is one of the goals, I would think.
Yes, that's an excellent idea. That's
Right.
an excellent idea. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Any other pressing questions before we move into an evaluation time?
No.
All right. What I need to do, I'm going to, let's see. Just looking at my list here. Okay, Dr. Samuels is with you there, Margot, correct?
Yeah, she's here with me. So we will step out of the room and leave her.
So if you can just leave Dr. Samuels at the computer. And let's see. Lorraine King, I'm going to take you out of the session for a time, probably be 10 or 15 minutes. If you watch your screen, eventually it'll say you're on hold, and then eventually you'll be off hold and you'll be back in the session with us. So I'm going to do that right now. Okay, so now I just need Dr. Samuels to join us here at the microphone.
Thank you, Dr. King.
Thank you, Margot. All right, I'm going to share my screen for a moment. Do one more thing.